So in Starship Troopers, Robert Heinlein said this, and it really got my noggin jogging. Man has no moral instinct. He is not born with moral sense. You were not born with it, I was not, and a puppy has none. We acquire moral sense, when we do, through training, experience, and the hard sweat of the mind. And I think nothing exemplifies this point more than the gang crime currently gripping London. In August, the Daily Telegraph published this article. Let's talk about gang culture's elephant in the room, absent black fathers. And I would suggest that this is a continuation of Heinlein's assertion that moral sense is not being taught to young men in inner cities. The author's a man called Tony Sewell, and I don't know anything about him, but he says, I used to be a member of the Youth Justice Board, and one of my tasks was visiting youth offending units. These spaces were teeming with young men who looked like me. I could have been their father or even grandfather. Many were locked up because of knife crime violence. I wanted to know the reason why. So-called experts were telling me that it was all about austerity and a lack of youth facilities, while others claimed it was a dearth of suitable role models. In a new report, Ian Duncan Smith, the former Conservative Party leader, argued for a tougher line on gangs, particularly with a policing policy unafraid to get tough on black communities where there was a disproportionate amount of knife crime. I wasn't going to be sucker punched into believing these young men were not responsible for their own crimes and misdemeanours. Smart policing obviously plays a role in tackling crime, but I wanted to know why this issue excessively affected a particular community. Every boy said that their problems started when their fathers left the home, while others were haunted by the father they never knew. This is also the reality of most of the boys they lived alongside. What we have are black boys thrown together from all backgrounds without fathers. According to official statistics, black children are significantly more likely to grow up in single-parent families. These boys are like Hamlet, thinking too much about their absent fathers. This ghost has not been exorcised. They have simply been left looking at their peers, which is like looking in a mirror. They also have a strong right arm, and they'll too often put it to ill use. And that really strikes home with me, because like I said, my father was in the RAF. I've said this before, but my father was in the RAF. And at times when I was a teenage lad, he would have to go away for like 6 months to like Iraq or the Falkland Islands or something like this. And during those times, I would be going noticeably off the rails in terms of my own behaviour, which would instantly be rectified the moment my father walked through the door. And so I can't help but think that there is something innate in the psychology of young men, not black men, young men, that means that they need to be effectively policed. They need to have their behaviour policed by an older male role model. It doesn't necessarily have to be a father, but I suspect that the father's probably the best person for the job. What I'm saying is the father needs to be around to teach the young man moral sense. And I think this is particularly important in the case of young men. I'm sure it's true of young women too, but I think it's especially true of young men because young men are strong. That's what people seem to not want to really think about. There's a reason why we used to send young men to war. They were the ones best suited for it. And now they're wasting their time in inner cities and doing nothing of any value. The worrying thing about crime in black communities is that now it's happening in a second generation. A culture of black masculinity has taken hold in Jamaica, the big cities of America and the UK, where black men produce children without feeling the need to take responsibility for them. Policymakers and politicians in the UK will not touch this area. Even sociologists, who should know better, have run to the mantra of institutional racism to explain the realities of the black family breakdown. When I have talked about this issue, I have been accused of blaming the victim or of letting white people off the hook. And that's exactly the problem, isn't it? We're not talking about victims, we're talking about perpetrators. Why are they perpetrators? And I do genuinely think that this is an issue of a lack of moral sense, because I think there is some reason, and I don't know what that reason is, but for some reason, young men don't take firm moral instruction from their mothers. And I think it might be to do with the fact that the young men are in some subconscious way aware of the fact that their fathers can kick their asses. I think that it's genuinely important for young men to know that they are not the apex of physical power in their own household, because I don't think that they have the moral sense inculcated into them at this sort of in the teenage years to allow them to make good moral decisions. And yet, if there's no father around the house, they are the apex of physical power in their household, and I imagine that many of them use it. When I put this to my sample group of black boys, they all laugh. One boy says, "No one knows what to do with us. We are the lost sons." That's tragic, isn't it? It's bloody heartbreaking if you think about it. These lost sons confound everyone, from Duncan Smith and his strong-arm tactics to Diane Abbott and her denial of the black family being in crisis. Partly as a consequence of absent fathers, a black feminism has emerged along with Abbott and her supporters that sees women as superheroes, capable of bringing up their children just as well without the men. The black boys in the youth offending unit would say the opposite. This feminism isn't working for us, they say. It forgets the existence of a masculinity with all its deadly instincts. A father going AWOL is something akin to post-traumatic stress disorder. When the father is absent or failing in his duty, our boys are left isolated and a danger. It's no surprise that the experts in this field are older men who provide what I call law lines for the boys to follow. It is not only Afro-Caribbean communities that face this horror. Talk to women from the Somali community, for example, and they will say that the absence of a male figure in their homes has meant their boys have gone wild. It's also interesting that in middle-class West African households, where both mum and dad are more likely to be present, the boys are doing exceptionally well. In fact, the latest figures show these boys are more likely to go to university than white working-class boys, which tells you a lot about institutional racism, doesn't it? Or the lack thereof, I would say. But you never hear about this. The conversation around knife crime has been reduced to initiatives that have no links to the real causes. There is an answer which lies not in more youth clubs or police on the street, but psychological intervention, where young boys can confront the demon within. Unfortunately, no one really cares about such solutions. It's far easier not to ruffle any feathers. It's absolutely tragic, isn't it? Dr. Tony Sowell is the CEO of the charity Generating Genius. I've never heard of him. But he's a doctor, and he's a black man, and presumably a father, and he seems to be identifying something that I think exists as well. And it's not just him that says this. This is the opinion also of ex-gang members. Let's have a listen.
People need to understand that these young people caught up in this lifestyle, 90% are coming from fatherless households.
Right.
The other one is there's a statistic that the Ministry of Justice has actually put out. 76% of male inmates either had no father figure or no relationship with their fathers. And what we seem to be forgetting...
But the government can't provide fathers, Mr. Thomas.
No. I'm saying we still need to ask the community to take account of that, because at the end of the day, if the community doesn't acknowledge...
But what do you mean by that? When you say the community, what do you mean? In practical terms, I see and you've backed it up with some very compelling figures, but what are you saying the community should do as a result?
Well, I think that we as a community need to take ownership for our children. So, for instance, there was a demonstration last week marching against violence of the young people dying, but the people who are marching, it's their children that are killing other children. So you've got to face the fact that if children in our own communities are killing other children, we've got to take some sort of ownership as well. We can't blame everything on the government. Yes, the fact that the reduction in police may have had some impact, I've got no proof of that, but may have had some impact. But at the end of the day, parents have got to take ownership of what their children get up to. For instance, the work I do, we see children out at 2 o'clock in the morning who are 12, 13 years old, who's supposed to be in bed. So yes. Who can you blame for that? You can't blame the government. Where are the parents of these children? And again, I'm not singling out every child.
No. Well, that gentleman made some absolutely excellent points. And Nick Ferrari, who's a commentator I usually quite enjoy, actually, seemed to kind of dismiss them because they were something the government couldn't deal with. I would suggest, Nick, is that perhaps the government can stop listening to people who will blame the problems of fatherlessness in the black community on white people. Because, as this chap was saying, it's not someone else's fault. It's the fault of these communities and the decisions that they are making that are having consequences to their children. And again, I don't think this is just black people. I think that white people suffer from this too. For example, today, teenagers in Durham town are attacking police and overwhelming them to the point where the police had to use pepper spray to get them to fuck off. Up to 100 teenagers surrounded police in the town centre before a mob attacked officers during an appalling disturbance. Fireworks and bricks were launched at a community officer was punched in the face in Stanley in County Durham, so not London for anyone's outside of the UK. The police have launched text alert service to inform parents of local disorder, urging them to take responsibility for their children.
Right, come on, everybody else, move over here. Hurry. Move back. Move back. Move back now.
It is, but look what's going on. Can you not see what's going on around?
What you doing, Baggins? What you doing?
Parents were asked to come and review the footage from the officers' body cams of the incident that night. They all agreed the behaviour of their children was appalling.
These kids seem to be mostly white, and they are doing the same thing. What are they doing wandering around the town late at night? Let alone attacking police officers. When it's white kids, the police go straight to the parents and say, this is your fault. Because it fucking is. It is their fault for not controlling their children. It absolutely is their fault. But as soon as it's a black family, oh, now it's the state. Now it's institutional racism. Now it's someone else's fault. Fuck off. It is the fault of the parents who have failed to instill moral sense in their own children. They are responsible for this. And I will have to do the same for my children, like my father did for me. And it's not like there haven't been black men who, in this regard, I would suggest are probably quite credible, speaking out about this. I mean, back in 2012, David Lammy, a Labour MP whom broadly I do not agree on many issues, identified that absent fathers were also the cause of knife crime because, again, they are not teaching moral sense to their own children. Of course, The Guardian is on the other side of this issue. It can't possibly be the fault of black men who didn't raise their own children to be decent human beings. It has to be someone else's fault. It has to be someone else's fault because if it's their fault, we can't blame racism, can we? And let's be fair, that's the only solution The Guardian can ever present. Do something about racism. Well, we've done everything we can. We've criminalised it. We've made it pathological, so we can't even talk about certain subjects without being accused of it. It still hasn't gone away. If anything, the problems have got worse. And it's got to the point now where the Met Police now have to be armed with guns in order to crack down on these knife crime gangs. Where the fuck does this end? What happens when some of these black urban youths get shot by the cops because they were going to stab the cop if he didn't do something? What happens? Oh, we know exactly what's going to fucking happen. Institutional racism. This is black people being persecuted. Blah, 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 blah. It's nothing of the sort. It is, as Heinlein said, and as I will continue to repeat, a lack of moral sense being instilled by the parents. There is no other solution than for the parents of these children to take ownership of these children and their behaviour, because they are the ones responsible for it.